Good evening, everybody. This is the Royal Dog History Club. We are live on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm just gonna mute one moment my two amazing speakers. We are live on Facebook and on YouTube for a very, very special heritage and history event to commemorate the Queen's Jubilee this year, and also to celebrate our local heritage with support from the Royal Dogs team. What is happening this year is history in the making. Next month, the Queen will become the first monarch in British history to mark 70 years on the throne. No other monarch has had a platinum jubilee ever in the history of the United Kingdom. Plans for the historical jubilee have recently been announced, including plans to get the community together to celebrate during a 4-day bank holiday weekend in June. That is how all of you can get involved. So you can start thinking of street parties. There's a plan for a big community lunch. And we thought that this announcement is the perfect excuse to have a look at the history of street parties in England. And we will do that with Chris Gittings from the street party history side. I'm going to unmute Chris so he can say goodbye. Good evening to everybody.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you.
And Chris, you're joining us from Bristol, is that correct?
Near Bristol, a village outside Bristol, yes.
So welcome, and thank you very much for being with us this evening. And for a lot of different reasons, some of them even personal, we also thought that the Jubilee of the longest and more popular, the longest serving and more popular queen ever should precisely be the moment to look back and make justice to a woman who has gone down in history as a very popular, disliked, evil queen, horrible woman. I'm talking about Mary Tudor, more commonly known as Bloody Mary. Because that's what we all think about her. She was very bad, she killed a lot of people, the end. But actually, there is much more and many positive things to say about the woman who, after all, was the first woman to be a reigning queen in England. And that is why we have with us tonight, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this well. If not, please correct me, Dr. Gregory Slysz, who is the head of history at the College in London, but also wrote a book called Mary Tudor, England's First Queen Regnant, Truth is the Daughter of Time. And he will tell us more about this later. Good evening, Gregory.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you about this subject.
Everybody who knows me knows that Catherine of Aragon is my favorite historical figure. So I'm doing this for Mary Tudor's mummy as well.
What a good...
And finally, the moment some of you might have been waiting for, because it has been thanks to all of you who have been sharing photos and memories, that we have been able to put together a video about the history of street parties, but through historical photos of street parties in the last century in Newham. I'm really, really grateful to all of you who have shared memories, photos, different files from your family albums, also from local archives. And with that video, it's like an 11 minutes short documentary, we will close today's event. So if you want to watch the world premiere of the video, you have to stay until the end of the show. As always, if you're watching live, please leave a comment to say hello, to let us know from where are you watching us this evening, what is your connection with any of the topics we are discussing tonight, or from where are you watching this evening, or please leave a comment with either with a question for either Chris or Gregory. I'll do my best to read all of the questions during the live streaming, and Chris and Gregory will try to stay for as long as possible, so they may either answer your question live today, but this video is going to stay both on the Facebook page and the YouTube page where you are watching. So if they don't have time to answer this evening, I can come back to them via email with your questions. They will reply to me and I will ping the answer to your question. So if you have any question for them, even if any of them has left, do still write and send the questions, because I can come back after the live streaming in the next days and provide you with an answer from any of them. But before we begin, I'm really, really devastated and sad to share with all of you, especially all of those of you who knew her, that one of honorary presidents, Valerie Aliyev, has recently passed away. I'm kind of like mixed up, getting my words wrong now because I'm a bit emotional about this. We are going to dedicate today's History Club to Valerie's memory, because there would be no History Club without Valerie and without Valerie's best friend, Rose Guinea. This History Club project was that idea. What we are doing now is Valerie and Rose's vision. And not only was she our honorary president and a co-founder of the History Club, she was also a very, very, very good friend to many of us, as well as a History Club co-founder, trustee of the Royal Docks Learning and Activity Centre. She was also an excellent historian and writer. But as was stated, as we are to lose Valerie, two things that give us, who knew Valerie, comfort is that she managed to make her dream a reality. And last year, she published her fascinating epic book, I, Francis Lovell, History of the War. It's a book about the history of the War of the Roses, but it's told as seen through the eyes of Richard III, best friend. And we are also very pleased to think that she is, wherever she's gone, heaven, up there, she is now with Rose Guinea, her best friend, and our other co-founder and the other honorary president. And I think right now they are having a glass of wine and watching this. So in memory of Rose and Valerie Aliyev, let's get this party started, because the show goes on. So talking about parties, let's talk about street parties first with Chris. I'm going to unmute Chris. Chris, first of all, could you briefly tell us about a street party? What is the website about? What sort of information and resources people can find on streetparties.org.uk, which is the project that you have been leading for many, many years?
Yeah, it's basically, if you Google street parties, you get this site. Anywhere in the world, it's all there. It's the basis of resource over 20 odd years of learning what makes it all tick, and particularly for helping people now to have a street party now, with some of the tricky questions they usually have, usually about road closures and insurance or bunting, and that's about it. So it's all the details, everything you need to know is on there. It's built up with stories and experiences from residents all around the country over the time since 2002. So if you ever want to know whether and how to have a street party, it's all there for you.
Chris, let's go back in time and tell us how did the concept of street parties start? When did the first street parties started to be organized by residents on a mass basis in the UK?
Well, that was exactly the question as a project we started to develop. It's like, where did all of this come in a particular format, which seems to be unique to the UK? And basically by digging around, I'm not a professional historian and have not been involved in this, but as a project, basically, we could not find any evidence of a form of a street party as we know it, particularly with children sitting at a table before 1919. Before then, there seems to have been general celebrations for many national events, for wars and coronations and jubilees, where there was street dressing, where there'll be flags and sort of the origins of bunting, and lots of use lots of ivy and plants to make arches and things. Street dressing is the word I've come up with. There was a lot of that, and there's quite a lot of evidence of that. But in 1919, it is clear that there were national proposals that after the signing of the Versailles Treaty, after the First War, for the summer of 1919, after the end of the war in 1918, to have some sort of celebratory elements. And it was specifically for children because they had suffered so much of being orphaned, and was a lot of poverty and difficulty at the time. So someone had this brainwave, it seems, in the British government, and it was put to councils as they were at the time around the country, and it did work. And so between July and August, street parties were created. At the time, they call them peace teas, because actually, obviously, that was the theme. And here is a picture of one extraordinary one in Fulham in West London, showing to some degree how poor and rough the kids were. But there they were. All the best was done by the community to sit the children down to have some sort of tea. It would have been pretty simple, not a lot because there wasn't a lot available, but the trouble was made, and they decorated the street, and the parents hung around, and that's where it seemed to start.
1935 was the first time ever that a jubilee, in this case a silver jubilee, was celebrated for a British monarch, and street parties as we know them today were organized. What can you tell us about that period?
Well, the thing is that between 1919 and 1935, there weren't any extra coronations or wars or anything. So in fact, this was the first national event after 1919. And so what had happened in 19 was it had really struck a chord as a formula. And here is this fantastic photograph in the Isle of Dogs showing exactly that. So the memory of and the sort of what had happened in 1919 was created by people again in 1935, and this seems to what started rolling as the tradition to keep it having at every national event. So that was it. 35 just happened to be the time, and that's when George V was his jubilee, and off it went.
I love this photo of Constance Street because it looks like nothing that this street looks now, and I have used this photo in the video that we'll see at the end of the show. So I was really, really pleased that thanks to Stan Dyson and a lot of other people who have shared photos like this in local groups, I was able to rediscover how this part of Newham used to look like.
Well, it was slightly interesting in that, if you saw, that in fact there wasn't a sit-down thing at that situation. The photograph was taken to show the children, yes, but it's the street dressing that's the big thing. You see the trouble they've gone to, the money that was probably spent. They've made a lot of things, and all the Union Jacks and the bunting and the flowers and the flags. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. So that at that moment in that event, that they were photographing the street dressing.
I've got a question for you, Chris, and this is not a question that I'm asking you. I know the answer, but I have to ask you because it's part of the show. It's a genuine question. I have been obviously doing some research in preparation for this. I understand what the jubilees were, what the coronation parties were, but I'm not very familiar, and I have found, as this one, a lot of photos in local groups. I have to say that people in local groups are amazing. They're doing an amazing job to keep the memories and the heritage alive. So there are a lot of posts and photos about Festival of Britain, which is 1951. It's not a year where the war finished. It's not a coronation. What was the Festival of Britain?
Well, I don't know a lot about it, but I mean, I'm sure the club members would know quite a lot. But the point was, it was that significant, and it was promoted as that significant on a national level for the whole country, so that they did have street parties, it seemed. Not a lot, but definitely some, and I have some evidence of that as well. And that was significant. It was basically a post-war thing. It was a festival of Britain for technology and culture for the post-war scenario of modernization. And I'm sure people have seen things about particularly happened in London, but it was accompanied by the process of street parties, which was extraordinary. So when I say national events, most of them are coronations and jubilees and that sort of thing. But in this case, it was a particular one-off, was the Festival of Britain 1951.
And 1977, the Silver Jubilee of the current Queen. This was, and this is information I found on your website, the biggest year in terms of how many people took to the streets. On your website, we can read that 10 million people took part in a street party for the 1977 Silver Jubilee. That figure is also according to the BBC. Why do you think so many people took to the streets for that particular celebration?
Exactly. Why was that? I mean, that must be something like a sixth of the entire population of Britain. I mean, it was massive. I mean, there weren't many cars at the time, so they didn't have the problem of road closures. Everything was very informal. You just sort of did it. That's where you didn't need permission or anything like that. But I think it just struck a chord at the time. And the key thing was that there was the memory of 1945, which was enormous, the VE Day street parties, which happened also in 1946. Some of them, but then the memory of all the people that had them in 45 said, "Hey, let's do it big time." And the country was a bit more wealthy. It was a time much more modern, and I have spoken to so many people. I was once in a massive conference with 3,000 people, and I said, "Who here had a street party in 77?" I tell you, half of the audience put up their hands. I mean, it does seem to be, and I've interviewed so many people, and that was the big one. And that's when, in a sense, the feeling about having a street party and what it involved really spread absolutely big time across the country.
Well, I'm sure that many people watching live or watching later this show will have very good memories of the 1977 Jubilee. So if you're watching this, please do leave a comment about your memories of street parties, or let us know which other celebrations or street parties you celebrated with your community. And we'll read as many of your comments tonight, but we'll keep an eye on all of the comments even after the live. If you have any questions, we'll keep answering them. Let's make this an engaging and participatory event. And talking about people's memories, Chris, for those who have memories of those parties, those events, what does these memories mean to them? What role have these street parties played in British social history?
Well, it is the bringing together for national events where instead of being aware that other people are organizing events, so that it's particularly from 1919, for example, there were a lot of things like banquets. There were activities for the returning soldiers demobbed. There were, the mayor would hold an event and the great and the good would attend and things like that. But the significance of street parties in Britain is this is where the general members of the public do it themselves in the way that they want, and they just get on with it. That's the key. It is a particular thing, so that the memory of it goes from one generation to another, so that when you talk to someone, I'm sure including some people watching now, when you say to them, "I had a street party in such a," their memory goes back, and it was such a big day when, for one day of the year, the cars are moved out and you just come out with all your neighbors, and here we are. We live in this street. The kids can knock around for a day and everyone has a good time. It's a very particular formula that is pretty unique in the entire world. Other countries do other sorts of all sorts of festivals and fiestas and this and that, but this is particularly in England and South Wales a thing. This is it. When you say street parties, you know what they mean. It involves, historically, it involves children sitting down, still like this one in 77. But following up from that, of course, nowadays people have just a general big barbecue, sometimes a sit down, but normally it's a sort of like everything goes. And one of the particular things also is the bunting. And you say bunting, everyone knows what bunting means, right? And they would have generally been made by people, occasionally bought. But what is bunting? Well, it seems from the signal flags of the Navy and Merchant Navy, where ships would communicate with each other, giving messages just by putting up the flags. The triangles are called pennants, and the bunts is in fact the communication officer of a ship. So it's called bunting. That's where it comes from. And we do it in this way. Though bunting is used in different countries around the world, many other countries don't actually necessarily use the triangle, the pennant. They have other forms. In fact, bunting, the most popular bunting country in the world, in fact, is the Philippines, bizarrely. I don't know why, but that's what they do. They don't have street parties, but they do bunting big time. In Spain, for example, they do different shapes and all sorts of decoration. But bunting is, you say bunting and street parties, they are inseparable.
What about because sometimes when we talk about street parties, like we're talking about something that was very big in the past. Big cities are being regenerated. The geography is changing. A lot of people don't longer live on a terrace house. They don't longer know their next door's neighbor. What about the new generations? How can they use an excuse and an opportunity as the Jubilee street parties to create a new sense of belonging, to create new ways of building community in these changing landscapes in cities and towns?
Yes, exactly that. So, I mean, things are different nowadays. People know each other less, but one of the key problems is the cars in the streets. We all know is not only that they are physically there, they are actually a sort of psychological barrier. If you take the cars out for a day, literally the public space opens up in front of you, and that is an amazing experience. And that is a key part of it. So the basic thing is as I say to people, and what the website is for, is just get on with it. I mean, just get on with it. You will meet your neighbors in a way you've not met before. And the formula is quite simple, really, but it really comes down to a few neighbors talking to each other and say, hey, let's do it. And in most streets, if you ask the neighbors, most streets will want to do it. And more than half, 3/4, not everyone wants to go. Of course, not everyone does, but most people do, and it is a matter of just being organized. It's not really terribly different like organizing some big family get-together. And basically everyone brings to share. So it's not one person organizing it. You don't necessarily need a formal committee or anything like that, but you need to sort of like, everyone's got to share out all the jobs and everything like that, and just come together for a fixed period of time on a Saturday or Sunday usually.
Thank you very much, Chris. Before we start talking to Dr. Gregory Slysz, let's have a look at some of the comments of people who have been who are joining us live this evening. John says, "Hi everybody, looking forward to some history." John, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope you find this very interesting. Eddie says, hello, everyone. Eddie, thank you very much for being live with us. I know people can watch after, but I love when you guys watch live because we can then have a conversation. Robert Rogers, he's tuning in from a very chilly Norfolk. But for those who don't know Robert, he used to be the secretary of the Newham History Society, and he is also in one of the photos of the closing video. So wait for that. Joy Karen Cantor is also joining us this evening. Somebody from the Red Flag says, I loved it. My parents helped organize ours. It was fun. And then it rained. I sheltered under a table. But I think British people, I mean, even when it rains, the party goes on, doesn't it?
It is. I've even seen people go in their house, put on their swimming trunks and snorkels, and come out into the rain and carry on.
Great news from the Royal Dogs Learning and Activity Centre. We will have a Jubilee street party on Albert Road and St John's Green for the Jubilee on the 1st of June. So, Chris, we may be coming to you for advice.
I'd love if you were able to take a photograph, a big group photograph. I'd love to get that and put it on the street party website. If you just emailed me, that would be great.
That's going to happen. I'll make sure that happens. And Gareth Evans, who, by the way, is my husband, who is also running the History Club as volunteers for some events with me. He's also saying hello. Gareth, I'm very happy you're watching. If not, you will have troubles with me later tonight. And Gareth is actually a colleague of Gregory, so I think it's a very nice transition from Gareth to Gregory. Chris, thank you so very much. I'll make sure you get that photo. I'll make sure to connect with you to ask for advice for the street party that the Red Flag has said will happen on the 1st of June.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to stay on the screen for as long as you can. I know you have to leave early. And also, if you have any question for Gregory after his talk, by all means, get involved. I'm going to unmute Gregory now.
Hello, that was very interesting, Chris. Thank you very much for that.
And I'm going to, so as I said at the beginning, the Jubilee of the most popular, longest-serving queen is the excuse to look back at what is truth and what is perhaps not what we thought to be true about a woman who has gone down in history as a horrible, evil queen, Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary. This, more or less, is the idea or the image that people have of Bloody Mary, of Mary Tudor, in popular culture. But the thing is, and I'm going to now show you the book that Gregory wrote, that she was, in fact, we tend to forget, because there's so much negativity about her, that we tend to forget that she was actually the first woman to reign as queen in England. Gregory, thank you very much for being with us this evening. And first question is, why did you decide to make Mary Tudor your subject of your history research and write this book?
Well, I generally like controversial topics. And I was, at the time, putting together a project of a number of controversial topics that provoke debate, and it was meant to form a book in itself. And Mary Tudor was going to be one of the themes, and it was going to take up a chapter. But when I got to the end of, say, 10,000 words, I discovered that I only scratched the surface. And it was a very fascinating topic to me, and I got very puzzled as to why a woman who appeared to me to have been quite successful got such bad press. And I then began to look at the competing historiography, and began to do some research myself. And by the time I was finished, it turned out to be a book-length manuscript. So there you go. That's why the book was published.
The title of the book is very significant. You have used as a subtitle, "Truth is the Daughter of Time." And this was actually her motto. And it's fascinating because it looks like she, in a way, predicted the future. She knew that it could happen to her, that for a long time, the things that would be told about her were not exactly the truth.
Yes, it was her motto, like you said, and she knew the truth of what was going on, and she knew that time will exonerate her. And I think she's having the last laugh. And yeah, had she lived longer, then we wouldn't be talking about this, I suspect, because the situation in England and elsewhere in the world would have been a lot different. But in any case, the motto is very fitting, I think, given that it took 400 years or so before her reputation was corrected. And you did show there a picture that was a poster for the London Dungeon exhibition of a few years ago. And when this actually came up when I was doing some research and on her, and it still quite amazed me because the scholarly research that was being done for about 20 years now, new material was being added, didn't seem to be having a great effect on the popular imagery. So that motivated even more myself to set the record straight and to actually include this material in the book and reference this in the book.
For those who are not very familiar with Mary's story, she was the only surviving child of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, whom he divorced. It's not only that she became the first woman to be a queen of England, but it's nearly a miracle. She nearly could have lost her life as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, before she became queen, she endured enormous stress and hardship. First, during her father's life, when she and her mother, Catherine, were essentially ostracized and banished. Henry himself forbade the two to meet, which must have been very stressful for both of them. And she was a very young girl at the time. So she got a very good education in courtly politics. And Henry was doing this, of course, for political reasons, because she refused to acknowledge him as a supreme head, and Catherine likewise refused to acknowledge him, because to do so would mean that she was illegitimate, and Catherine would be labelled an illegitimate a queen, and that was something they couldn't do. Not only was it untrue in view of their faith, but it, of course, would have been a terrible personal anguish to them both. So she was pressured greatly by Henry and then by Cromwell to accept the supremacy, which she eventually did, but it was out of great anguish. And then, of course, after Henry's death, she endured more anguish under the reign of her brother. But by then, she was a grown-up woman, and she could withstand that more. And she stuck to her guns because he wanted to prohibit her from celebrating Mass, because by that time England was moving towards a more Protestant society. But she refused. She refused, and she stuck to her guns, and that was to great credit to her. So I like people who stick to their guns despite enormous pressure that is put on them. They're heroes to me.
And as you said at the start, I like when we look back at history and challenge what people have thought was the official side of things for a long time, and we have to analyze why we know the things we think we know, who wrote history. History is mostly written by the winning side, and that's why it's so important that we question and challenge. And this might sound like this is something that happened 500 years ago, but we can apply that to our life. How many times we judge people in a situation and we think we know when actually we don't. So history is living, it's an alive thing, and we can learn from this for our daily life. anyway. So yeah, so it's not something that happened only 500 years ago. But Gregory, why has she been castigated for so many centuries? Why did she get this reputation of an evil woman, one of the worst, most diabolical women in history? And
Yes,
funny thing, a lot of women have had this reputation.
yes. I mean, to me, the more that something is seen as received, I immediately question. So I don't know whether it's something in my character, but I always found crowd mentality very, very disturbing. And in terms of scholarship, I always question things that seem to be looked upon by the majority as truth. So she was, and there's always something there which the majority cannot quite answer. And this is something that I hone onto. Now, why was she castigated in this way? Well, because the history of Mary Tudor really goes through several stages. She needed to be isolated by Henry for the reasons that we stated, because she refused to accept his supremacy. But later on in British history, she represented the Catholic faith. And as Britain was moving towards Protestantism, it was establishing an identity, a national identity. And anyone who was who didn't quite fit into that national identity had to be castigated. And of course, Britain's identity was very much Protestant, and she was Catholic. She represented the enemy. She represented the enemy from within. She represented the enemy from outside, the external threat from Spain, from France, and she was the outsider. And this was how it was for many centuries. Britain then developed an empire, exporting its culture, its Protestant culture. They competed with Catholic powers on the seas. So there was no way that a Catholic monarch could be accommodated, and it wasn't until 1829 that Catholicism was legal in this country. So it was to be a Catholic, you were essentially didn't have the same rights. And even today, there is Catholics are the only religion in the country that is officially discriminated against. But that is a leftover from the past. So that is the main reason. But by the mid 20th century, the imperial legacy began to wane. Of course, Britain was losing the empire. Britain was re-engaging with Europe, joining the European community, and such. And religion, and the Protestant religion was being abandoned by many people, and certainly it wasn't held so passionately as it once was. So a revision could take place without creating too much upset. But when the historians began to revise this, when they began to delve into the Reformation, into the reputation of Mary, they found some astonishing things, and it began to be made very clear that the people who were writing about this for a couple of hundred years and then more had ulterior political motives. There's no question about that.
I read, and I was going to ask you if you could share an example of positive things about her, either from her persona or what she achieved as a monarch. For example, in preparation for today's event, I read that she actually was she worked very hard. She worked from very early hours in the morning until very late in the evening. And she didn't want to be kind of taken for granted. I'm the queen of a woman, but other people will rule. She was very involved in politics and the job of governing the nation. She was really hands-on in a world where women were not supposed to. what examples of positive things about Queen Mary
Absolutely.
Tudor?
I mean, if you read the old historiography of people like David Hume, Anthony Froude, James Anthony Froude, Albert Frederick Pollard, Geoffrey Elton, A.G. Dickens, and so on, you would get the impression that she was very incompetent. And those who would give her a little bit of leeway and say, well, she wasn't cruel, that was done by her advisors, nevertheless still insisted that she was incompetent and in some way deluded. But when you actually go into policy areas and what she did, you find a lot of success. She, for instance, paved the way for military and naval reform that Elizabeth, her sister, took on. She, of course, wasn't around for too long to be able to implement that. She revived the Catholic Church under very difficult conditions. Her foreign policy was slated as well, but if you look into that, it actually had quite a lot of successes. And she wasn't a walkover with regards to her husband, Philip of Spain. She actually confronted him, and she did not abide by his wishes to assist him in the Italian wars, for instance. So she was certainly a steadfast woman. And the image that emerges from the historiographical revision is a completely different character to what people before this revision got the impression of.
That's why it's so important that we have these conversations. But what could you tell us about the real responsibility that she had of so many people killed because being heretics? I mean, there's even a cocktail named after her, a Bloody Mary, which, by the way, is my favorite cocktail. I'm sorry about that. But it's called Bloody Mary because it's with tomato juice, represents the blood, represents the bloodshed that she was responsible for. So many people burnt alive, so many people prosecuted to death during her reign because of religion. However, well, I think one of the angles in your book is that yes, she must have been responsible for people dying because of their religion, but this also happened with her sister, Elizabeth. However, it is Mary who goes down in history as Bloody Mary, whereas Elizabeth is. I think sometimes people think Elizabeth was actually the first woman we had as a queen, the Virgin Queen, the perfect one.
Yeah, well, this is always the fallback position on critics, even to this very day. You know, they would say, "Oh yes, you've made your point about Mary's competence and her achievements, but ultimately she cannot surely be defended with regards to her religious policy." Well, yes, you can, and I have a chapter in the book called "Defending the Indefensible," and we have to recognize what heresy was in the 16th century. And the best way to view a heresy in the 16th century is to compare it to perhaps terrorism today. So a single terrorist can literally destroy a community, can plant a bomb and destroy a community. This is how heretics were viewed by both Protestants and Catholics at that time, because a heretic can literally start a civil war, and we saw that in continental Europe, bloody civil wars. So heresy was approached in a very very stern way by both Protestants and Catholics. But with regards to Mary's policy she sought to save what she believed were heretical souls. She wanted to save those souls from the fires of hell. That was the attitude. The fact that she's got this Bloody Mary sobriquet is owed to, of course, John Fox's and his Book of Martyrs. But even that way, his book is famous for the accounts of the interrogations and the actual burnings. But even he admits that the interrogators, people like Bloody Bonner, Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, they did everything they can to seek recantations from these people. So the burning was the final straw, but really the instructions were given trying to save these people from the fires of hell. And at the end of the day, around 300 Protestants were burnt. But even that, taken within the broader European context, was quite small. If we look at what was happening at the time in Europe, if we look at Henry VIII's murderous reign, if we look at Elizabeth, not only in England, her persecution of Catholics, but her policies in Ireland, we again come to the conclusion that this particular episode, while for modern consumption is not very nice, of course, but in contemporary context, it wasn't particularly extraordinary.
Horrible thing. We will all agree to prosecute, get people killed because of religion. But as you said, everybody else was doing it. Every other king and queen, but it's she who has gone down in history as bloody. The rest were amazing monarchs.
It suits the narrative. It suits the narrative. The narrative began to be created of not only her, but of the intolerant Catholic. And this then was extended to the Spanish. And it served as good propaganda. It was like, if we imagine the First World War propaganda, that the German soldier was bayoneting babies. So it was very similar to the propaganda against the bloody Spaniard. So that is why we had to defend ourselves against the Armada. We had to defend ourselves against the constant threat of invasion from either France or Spain. And this very much served as a narrative. And she was depicted as someone who was stopping progress. So you had the Reformation, which was again asserted as a popular movement. Now, of course, we know that it wasn't. And she was a spanner in the works. And it was we had to thank God that her reign only lasted for 5 years, so that the wheels could once again turn and the Reformation could be completed. And this was the narrative that was developed throughout the centuries, later on by Whig historians, by people like Macaulay, the great Macaulay, and it didn't really stop until the 20th century. But like you showed with popular culture, this still holds true.
In fact, you sent me a video that I think represents very well the idea people have of Mary Tudor in popular culture. I'm going to play it perhaps a couple of times. Look at this. She kind of becomes a zombie. Let's have a look again. What is this, Gregory? Where did you find this?
That was a London Underground advert that was supposed to be placed in the London Underground in tube trains, but it proved to be so horrific that literally the people thought that it would scare the horses and children and everyone else, so it was banned. But yes, it just shows that even very recently, the image of Bloody Mary sells, and it's still very much in people's collective memories. Not everyone can read scholarly texts, so they still very much have this image of her in their minds. And it's not only that. I mean, there were nursery rhymes made of her. You know, Mary, Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow? And it was quite a grotesque nursery rhyme, because every line of that is intended to highlight some kind of fault with her. So how does your garden grow, for instance, was intended to mock her infertility. This is something that little children were taught. So it was almost part of the national ideology. We always associate ideologies with continentals, But Britain very much had this national ideology, and it was based on Protestant progress, and it was dominated in the 18th and 19th century by Whig historians who emphasized the progress of Britain as opposed to the backwardness of the Europeans. And Mary continued to fit that narrative.
John says, can I ask, what's your view of Hilary Mantel's depiction of her as a young princess?
Again, this is still very much part of the narrative. I mean, the depiction of her as a princess is very much akin to Hilary Mantel's depiction of Thomas More as a bloody torturer. So these things don't go away. And there is another reason why this has been resurrected. So we do have a lot of scholarship that has essentially put the record straight. But nowadays, Catholicism is attacked for different reasons. It is attacked for being regressive socially. So to depict Mary as not very bright, as bloody, and to depict people like Thomas More likewise serves that narrative. So maybe we'll get another round of anti-Marian propaganda, but for a different reason. It's the same reason why she is not a feminist icon, because she really should be, because like you said at the start, that she was England's first Queen Regnant, and she was a very strong woman overcoming enormous adversity. I mean, most men wouldn't have overcome this in a man's world. Yet she, living in this man's world, who was bastardized by her father, persecuted by her father, persecuted by Edward, and yet she overcame this. So she really should be a feminist icon, but she isn't, precisely because of her faith.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for answering this question. I also want to say thank you to Alicia Dominguez, who has also participated with some of the comments that I have been showing on a screen, because Alicia is also a writer and she is specializing in Gothic literature. And I think she's finding a lot of, I've forgotten the word now, like parallelisms between Mary's story and a Gothic novel, that how she has been constructed as an evil force rather than the woman and the queen that she was. Gregory, thank you very, very much.
One last point, if I can make. So this really is a lesson for anyone who wants to get to the bottom of the story. And I mean, we have so much fake news and propaganda around now. So my rule of thumb, and this is the rule of thumb I always tell my students, is always go to the primary source. Always go to the primary source and base your information, your writing, on primary material. Because once you get to primary sources, you'll get a completely different picture from a secondary source.
I completely agree. And Gregory, I think it means so much, not only to you, but also to me. It means so much. It's so important that as we prepare to celebrate the Jubilee of the longest monarch, who happens to be a woman, we make justice to the first woman who was Queen of England. Gregory, thank you so very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And now to close today's show is the time for I think we can call it the world premiere of our 10 minutes documentary about street parties, the history of street parties, but through historical photos of street parties and big celebrations in Newham that a lot of you have been so kind to share with us, as well as local archives and other historical societies. I have really tried to credit everybody at the end of the video. However, if your name is not there at the end of the video when we say thank you, and your name should be there because you have been helping us in any way to make this video possible, please do leave a comment later, contact me, and I will do my best to have an addition, to add your name, to credit your organization when we share this video as a video alone, again on social media and in other platforms. And now I've never done this. I've played short videos, but it's the first time I play a 10-minute video, so I had to upload it in a different way. I hope this works. Let's cross fingers, everybody. Share video file, desktop. Right, everybody, I hope you like it. On the 6th of February, the Queen will become the first British monarch to celebrate a Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years on the throne. Plans include a big concert, a Thanksgiving service, and all leading up to a 4-day bank holiday in June. You can get involved. Think of street parties, but there's also a competition to create a pudding to celebrate the Queen. The coronation chicken recipe, which I love, and I have here in the shape of a sandwich, was actually invented for the Queen's coronation in 1953. So perhaps we can think of anything sweet inspired by Newham? Can you do anything sweet with the jelly deals? Let's travel back in time to see how people in Newham celebrated coronations and jubilees in the last century through photos from community members and local archives. "1935, Silver Jubilee of King George V. It was the first ever time that a Silver Jubilee, 25 years on the throne, had been celebrated for any king in British history before, and people were at the ready to celebrate. This street, Constance Street, has changed a lot since it was redeveloped in the 60s, but I think that some of you may still remember it as it was in the first photo of the next clip. The king died less than a year later. 1936 was the year of the three kings. King George V, who died in January, King Edward VIII, who abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, and King George VI. King George VI and Elizabeth coronation was scheduled for the 12th of May 1937. And once again, the people in Newham took to the streets to celebrate. George and Elizabeth led the country through the war. They were offered evacuation, but they never left. The Queen famously said, "The children won't live without me. I won't live without my husband and my husband, the king, will stay. And then when Buckingham Palace was bombed, she also said, I'm happy this happened because now I feel I can look at the East End in the face. She knew very well how much devastation the East End and the docks had suffered during the Blitz. No wonder places like this, Fernhill Street, were among the happiest places in the world on V-Day, on the 8th of May 1945. King George VI died in 1952 and his daughter became queen at the age of 25. Elizabeth II's coronation took place on the 2nd of June 1953, and what a party that was in the streets of Newham, including in here, Leonard Street. (1977), the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Many of you have great memories of that party, and looking at your pictures, you had a jolly time. Prince Charles married Diana Spencer on the 29th of July 1981. The wedding of the future king was a big reason for more celebrations, but also the last stop of our journey. But don't go yet, because I've got something else to tell you after the next clip. But jubilees are not only for the royal family. In 1936, West Ham had its own jubilee to celebrate 50 years of West Ham County Borough. And the buildings looked as amazing as in the next two pictures. The original Ferry Festival in the 70s and the 80s is such a big story that is a story for another day. However, the new Ferry Festival and many other community projects have brought festivals, street parties, celebrations and the community spirit back to the streets. And with some photos from recent times, we say, for now, goodbye.